In the rugged wilderness of Montana's Pryor Mountains, a small band of wild Mustangs had roamed freely for generations. Their lineage traced back to the Spanish horses that had escaped from early explorers, adapting to survive in this harsh but beautiful landscape. Among them was a striking mare with a distinctive chestnut coat marked by a perfect white diamond on her forehead. The locals, who occasionally spotted her from a distance, had nicknamed her Sierra for her ability to navigate the steep mountain terrain with remarkable grace. Sierra had become the lead mare of her small band, which included 5 other Mustangs. She possessed an intuitive understanding of the land, knowing where freshwater springs remained hidden even during drought seasons, sensing approaching storms before they appeared on the horizon, and memorizing safe passages through treacherous canyon walls. The stallion who protected their band, a powerful black Mustang with one white sock, was equally impressive. His muscular frame and vigilant nature had kept predators at bay for years, earning him the nickname Shadow among the local ranchers. Together, Sierra and Shadow had maintained their freedom in a world increasingly encroached upon by human development. They moved as one with the rhythms of the land, following ancient migration patterns their ancestors had established across these mountains. In spring, they would descend to lusher valleys, where tender shoots provided essential nutrients. During scorching summer months, they would climb to cooler elevations where Alpine's meadows offered both comfort and concealment. When autumn winds brought the first promise of winter, they would return to sheltered canyons where dense pine forests blocked the worst of the mountain blizzards. Life had followed this natural cadence for years, but recent seasons had brought unprecedented challenges. 3 consecutive years of drought had turned once reliable water sources into dusty depressions. Wildfires had scorched vast stretches of grazing land, leaving behind blackened earth where nutritious grasses once grew. Competition for remaining resources had intensified, with both wildlife and expanding cattle operations vying for the same diminishing territories. Sierra, heavy with foal during this particularly harsh season, faced mounting pressure to find sustainable terrain for her band. Her normally sleek body had grown rounder, her movements more deliberate as her pregnancy advanced. Shadow became increasingly protective, positioning himself between the mare and any potential threats, his ears constantly swiveling to detect dangers before they materialized. The changing climate had altered their familiar world beyond recognition. Springs that had flowed reliably for generations now produced mere trickles. Meadows that had once burst with lush vegetation lay brown and sparse. Sierra's instincts, honed through years of surviving this wilderness, signaled that their traditional territories could no longer sustain them, especially not with a vulnerable new foal soon to join their band. After weeks of increasingly desperate searching, Shadow and Sierra made the difficult decision to lead their band beyond the boundaries. They had always known the Mustangs moved with determination across unfamiliar territory, their hooves kicking up dust clouds as they traversed parched landscapes. Sierra, despite her pregnancy, maintained a steady pace, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest or graze on whatever sparse vegetation they could find. Their journey was fraught with danger. They navigated around expanding human settlements, crossed highways during quiet pre-dawn hours, and cautiously approached new water sources, alert for predators that might be lurking nearby. Each new territory brought unknown risks: domestic dogs that chased them from the peripheries of small towns, barbed wire fences that blocked traditional migration routes, and suspicious ranchers who viewed wild horses as competition for precious grazing land. One particularly harrowing night, they encountered a mountain lion crouched on a rocky ledge above their path. Shadow immediately positioned himself between the predator and the band, his powerful body coiled and ready to defend. Sierra urged the others forward while Shadow stood his ground, stomping and snorting until the big cat retreated deeper into the rocks. This encounter left Shadow with a long scratch along his flank, a painful reminder of their vulnerability in these unknown lands. As days stretched into weeks, Sierra's condition became increasingly concerning. Her sides had swollen dramatically, and her once fluid movements had become labored and deliberate. The band needed to find a secure location soon, somewhere with water, sufficient forage, and shelter from both the elements and potential threats. Shadow seemed to sense her urgency, scouting ahead more frequently and returning to guide the band toward promising territories. Their desperate search led them to the rolling foothills surrounding the Blackfoot River Valley, an area they had never before ventured into. Here, protected pockets of land remained relatively lush despite the drought, with scattered springs, feeding vibrant undergrowth and sheltered meadows. Most importantly, parts of this region had been designated as a wild horse sanctuary, though Sierra and her band couldn't possibly understand the human designation that might offer them protection. What they did recognize was the promise of the land itself. As they crested a gentle rise overlooking a sheltered valley, Sierra paused, her nostrils flaring as she tested the air. Below them lay a green haven with a small, clear stream cutting through its center. Cottonwood trees provided patches of shade, and the surrounding hillsides offered both protective vantage points and escape routes if needed. After weeks of grueling travel, they had found a place that might offer sanctuary for Sierra's approaching foal. Shadow moved cautiously down the slope, stopping frequently to assess for dangers, his ears swiveling and nostrils flaring. Sierra followed more slowly, her swollen belly requiring careful navigation of the descent. The rest of their small band fanned out behind them, exhausted but alert after their long journey. None of them could know that this valley was part of the Wild Mustang Rehabilitation Center, a place where humans actually sought to protect rather than threaten wild horses like themselves. The Wild Mustang Rehabilitation Center sprawled across 300 acres of protected land, a sanctuary created through the tireless efforts of its founder, Jackson Reeves. At 58, Jackson's weathered face told the story of decades spent under the Montana sun, deep lines etched around eyes that had witnessed both the beauty and brutality of wild spaces. His tall frame, still strong despite the passing years, moved with the deliberate economy of someone accustomed to conserving energy for long days of physical work. Jackson hadn't always been devoted to saving Mustangs. Before establishing the center, he had served for 22 years as an Army Ranger, completing multiple combat tours that left him with both physical and invisible scars. The shrapnel embedded in his left leg from an IED in Afghanistan gave him a slight limp that worsened in cold weather. The memories embedded in his mind gave him nightmares that still occasionally woke him in the dead of night, heart racing and body drenched in sweat. His transition to civilian life had been rocky at first. The adrenaline-fueled urgency of combat missions had left him ill-equipped for the mundane rhythms of ordinary existence. He had drifted between jobs, security consultant, wilderness guide, ranch hand, finding each lacking in purpose. The turning point came during a particularly dark period. When driving aimlessly through backcountry roads, he encountered a small band of wild Mustangs being aggressively rounded up by a ranching operation. Something about the panic in those horses' eyes as helicopters drove them toward capture pens had triggered both protective instincts and painful recognition. Jackson saw in those terrified animals a reflection of his own trauma, the experience of having one's freedom and dignity stripped away by forces beyond comprehension. That day, he had confronted the ranchers, negotiated the purchase of 4 Mustangs destined for slaughter, and discovered his new mission. Working alongside Jackson at the center was Maya Cooper, a wildlife veterinarian whose expertise in equine medicine had proven invaluable. At 34, Maya had already established herself as one of the region's foremost authorities on wild horse populations. Her mixed Blackfoot and European ancestry gave her a unique perspective on the land and its history. She often spoke of how her grandfather had taught her that Mustangs weren't just animals, but living connections to the continent's past, embodiments of freedom that deserved protection. Maya's slender build belied her physical strength. Years of wrestling injured animals and carrying heavy equipment across rough terrain had built wiry muscles capable of surprising force when necessary. Her dark hair was typically pulled back in a practical braid, and she rarely bothered with makeup while working, though turquoise earrings, a gift from her grandmother, were a constant presence. The relationship between Jackson and Maya had evolved from professional respect to deep friendship over their 5 years of collaboration. They balanced each other effectively. Jackson's intuitive understanding of horse behavior complemented Maya's scientific knowledge, while her optimism often counteracted his occasional bouts of combat-triggered pessimism. Together, they had transformed the center from a small rescue operation into a significant conservation effort that now included rehabilitation programs, breeding protection, and educational outreach. Their morning routine typically began before sunrise. This particular day, Jackson had risen at 4:30 a.m., his sleep interrupted by both old nightmares and new concerns about an approaching storm front. The rehabilitation center currently housed 17 Mustangs in various stages of recovery, some from injury, others from malnutrition, and a few simply being monitored before potential release back to federally protected lands. Jackson pulled on worn jeans and a flannel shirt before stepping onto the porch of his modest cabin, which sat on a ridge overlooking the center's main valley. The pre-dawn air carried the sharp scent of pine mixed with the earthy musk of horses and soil. He sipped black coffee from a battered thermos while surveying the landscape below, mentally cataloging the day's necessary tasks while watching for any unusual movement among the horses already under their care. The radio on his belt crackled to life just as the eastern sky began to lighten. "Jackson, you up?" Maya's voice came through clearly despite the early hour. "Been up," he responded tersely, his voice still gravelly from sleep. "Something wrong?" "Maybe not wrong, but interesting. The motion sensors on the North Ridge triggered 3 times last night. Might be nothing, but with the drought pushing wildlife into new territories." "I'll check it out," Jackson interrupted, already shifting into assessment mode. "Meet you at the equipment shed in 15. By the time Jackson arrived at the shed, Maya was already loading a field kit into one of the center's all-terrain vehicles. Her movements were precise and economical, evidence of having performed these preparations countless times before. She handed him a pair of binoculars without comment. "Motion sensors could be anything," Jackson said, settling the binoculars around his neck. "Deer, elk, maybe even those teenagers from town thinking it's funny to trespass." Maya shook her head. Pattern wasn't right for deer or elk, too deliberate, and the sensors triggered in sequence, moving from east to west along the boundary. Whatever it was traveling with purpose. Jackson nodded, respecting her analysis. Maya had an almost uncanny ability to interpret animal behavior from minimal data. As they loaded the last of their equipment, the sky brightened enough to reveal heavy clouds gathering on the western horizon. The promised storm would arrive by afternoon, complicating whatever work lay ahead. They traveled in comfortable silence up the rutted service road that wound toward the northern boundary. Jackson drove with the focused attention of someone who had navigated much more dangerous terrain under far worse conditions, automatically adjusting for rough patches and steep inclines. Maya periodically checked readings on a tablet that monitored the center's security system, confirming that no new alerts had triggered since the pre-dawn activity. As they crested the final rise before the northern ridge, Jackson cut the engine. "We'll go on foot from here," he said quietly. "Less chance of spooking whatever might be out there." They moved with practiced coordination, Jackson naturally taking point, while Maya followed slightly behind and to his right, a formation ingrained during his military years and adopted by their partnership without discussion. The morning light strengthened gradually, revealing a landscape transformed by drought. What should have been verdant early summer growth instead showed the muted browns and yellows of stressed vegetation. Jackson suddenly raised his hand in the universal signal to stop, dropping into a crouch. Maya froze immediately, her eyes following his sightline toward a small clearing ahead. There, partially obscured by a stand of junipers, was the unmistakable silhouette of wild horses. Not just one or two, but a small band that had somehow found their way onto the sanctuary's protected land. Jackson and Maya remained motionless, their experienced eyes carefully assessing the Mustang band that had wandered onto their sanctuary. 6 horses in total, 4 mares, 1 stallion, and what appeared to be a yearling colt. Even from this distance, Jackson could see that these weren't just any wild horses. They were Pryor Mountain Mustangs, recognizable by their distinctive conformation and coloring that reflected their Spanish ancestry. "They're not from our usual herds," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle rustle of wind. "Through the juniper branches, must have traveled at least 70 miles from their traditional range." Jackson nodded, raising his binoculars to study the animals more carefully. The black stallion stood alert at the edge of the group, his powerful muscles visibly tense beneath his glossy coat. One white sock on his right foreleg stood out in stark contrast against his dark body. "Stallion's injured," Jackson murmured, noticing a long scratch along the horse's flank. "Not serious, but relatively fresh." When his gaze shifted to the chestnut mare with the white diamond marking, his breath caught. "Maya," he said quietly, passing her the binoculars. "Lead mare on the left. She's heavily pregnant." Maya studied the mare intently, her trained eye assessing the animal's condition. "Very pregnant," she confirmed. "Probably within days, maybe even hours of foaling, and she's showing signs of exhaustion. Look at how she's favoring her right foreleg and the way she's breathing, rapid and shallow." The mare's sides heaved visibly with each breath, her once graceful movements now labored and deliberate. Despite her condition, there remained an undeniable dignity in how she carried herself, head high and eyes alert, despite her obvious fatigue. "Drought must have pushed them out of their territory," Jackson reasoned, his voice reflective. "Same story everywhere this year. Natural water sources drying up, grazing land compromised. They're desperate." Maya nodded, her expression conveying both concern and determination. "We need to monitor them, especially that mare. If she foals in her current condition..." She didn't need to finish the thought. Both knew that a difficult birth in the wild, particularly for an exhausted mare, could easily result in the loss of both mother and foal. The drought had already taken a significant toll on wild horse populations throughout the region. "We'll set up an observation blind," Jackson decided, mentally calculating the logistics. "Close enough to intervene if necessary, far enough not to spook them." The next few hours were spent in careful preparation. They retrieved additional equipment from their vehicle: a camouflage blind, monitoring equipment, emergency veterinary supplies, and enough provisions to maintain a watch for at least 48 hours. Experience had taught them to prepare for extended field operations whenever possible. They established their observation post downwind from the Mustang band, positioning it near a small copse of trees that offered both concealment and a clear view of the meadow where the horses had settled. Maya set up specialized long-range monitoring equipment, a thermal imaging camera to track the mare's temperature fluctuations, and a powerful spotting scope mounted on a tripod. By mid-afternoon, Dark clouds had gathered overhead, casting the landscape in premature twilight. The first drops of rain began to fall as Jackson and Maya settled into their observation routine, one watching while the other recorded notes, switching roles every 2 hours to maintain fresh perspective. "She's showing early signs," Maya noted during her observation shift around dusk of their first day of monitoring. "See how she's separating slightly from the group? Classic pre-foaling behavior, wants isolation for protection." Jackson studied the mare through the scope, noting how she would take a few steps away from the band before the stallion would herd her back. Stallion's not making it easy. He's keeping the group tightly clustered, probably sensing predators. "Nearby. Can't blame him," Maya replied, glancing toward the darkening forest edge. "With the drought, mountain lions have been pushing into lower elevations following prey. These horses are in unfamiliar territory without knowing the safe zones." As night fell, they switched to infrared monitoring, allowing them to observe the Mustang's heat signatures against the cooling landscape. The temperature dropped rapidly with the rain, creating challenging conditions for a potential birth. Jackson retrieved thermal blankets from their supplies, handing one to Maya while wrapping, another around his own shoulders. "Reminds me of survival training in the mountains of Afghanistan," he commented, his voice distant with memory. "Waiting in the cold, knowing something important was about to happen, but not exactly when or how." Maya glanced at him, recognizing one of the rare moments when Jackson voluntarily referenced his military past. "Any wisdom from those experiences that applies here?" she asked gently. A wry smile briefly crossed his weathered face. "Just that patience is usually rewarded, eventually, and that appearance can be deceiving. Seeming calm often precedes the storm." As if confirming his words, the mare suddenly dropped to her knees, her heat signature intensifying as she rolled onto her side. The other Mustangs immediately formed a protective circle around her, with the stallion positioned facing outward, clearly on high alert. "It's starting," Maya said urgently, adjusting the focus on their monitoring equipment. "Earlier than I expected. Given her behavior, but these things aren't exactly predictable." For the next hour, they watched intently as the mare experienced waves of contractions. The rainfall intensified, drumming against the roof of their blind and occasionally gusting through the observation ports. Despite the weather, they maintained unwavering focus on the unfolding drama. "Something's wrong," Jackson finally stated, his tone flat but underlaid with concern. "She's been in active labor for over an hour, with minimal progress." Maya nodded grimly, already reaching for her medical kit. "The foal might be malpositioned. See how she keeps trying to rise and then dropping back down? She's not getting the leverage she needs to deliver." "Options?" Jackson asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Limited," Maya replied honestly. "We can continue to observe and hope she manages on her own, but given her exhaustion and the conditions..." She hesitated, both of them knowing what intervention would entail, approaching a wild, distressed mare protected by a potentially aggressive stallion in darkness and pouring rain. "If we don't intervene, and there are complications, we lose." "Them both," Jackson stated matter-of-factly, already checking the tranquilizer gun they carried for emergencies. "If we intervene, we risk injury to ourselves and potentially traumatizing the band." Maya met his gaze steadily. "There's a third possibility. We could try to separate the mare from the band, tranquilize her, assist with the birth, and then withdraw before she fully recovers. Minimal human contact." Jackson considered this approach, mentally mapping the terrain and calculating risks. "Separating her will be the challenge. That stallion isn't going to give her up easily." "No." Maya agreed, "but he's already injured, and they're all exhausted from their journey. We might be able to create a distraction sufficient to isolate her briefly." Outside, the mare released a low, pained whinny that cut through the sound of falling rain. The stallion responded immediately, moving closer to her side, his posture simultaneously protective and uncertain, a powerful guardian suddenly faced with a threat he couldn't fight. "We need to decide now," Maya urged, watching the mare struggle through another unproductive contraction. "Her energy is flagging. I don't think she can sustain this effort much longer." Jackson's expression hardened into resolute determination, reminding Maya of why his former military colleagues had nicknamed him Steel. Once committed to a course of action, he became an immovable force. "Gear up," he said simply, reaching for his rain poncho. "We go in carefully together. I'll handle the stallion, you focus on the mare. Standard approach protocol until we need to adapt." As they prepared to leave the relative safety of their blind, the skies opened up completely, sheets of rain now pounding the landscape. Lightning flashed in the distance, briefly illuminating the scene. The huddled Mustangs, the struggling mare, and two humans preparing to risk everything to save a wild creature that would never understand their intervention. The rain lashed against Jackson's face as he emerged from the blind, each droplet feeling like a tiny needle against his weather-worn skin. His military training had prepared him for operations in all conditions, but there was a significant difference between stalking enemy combatants and approaching wild horses in distress. Behind him, Maya moved with quiet efficiency, her medical kit secured in a waterproof backpack and a specialized folding stretcher strapped across her shoulders. "Remember," Jackson whispered over his shoulder, barely audible above the rain, "slow movements, no direct eye contact with the stallion. If he charges, don't run. Stand your ground and make yourself large." Maya nodded, her face set with determination beneath the hood of her poncho. She had assisted with difficult births before, but always with Mustangs that had already been brought into the rehabilitation program. Never with completely wild horses in field conditions this challenging. They advanced using the available cover, moving from tree to shrub during periods when the Mustang's attention was focused on the laboring mare. The darkness worked both for and against them, providing concealment but making each step treacherous on the rain-slicked terrain. Every few yards, they paused to reassess the situation, communicating through hand signals developed during years of fieldwork together. From 50 yards away, they could clearly hear the mare's labored breathing and occasional distressed whinnies. The other Mustangs had formed a tight defensive circle, their bodies creating a living wall around their vulnerable herdmate. The stallion paced restlessly, his movements betraying increasing agitation as the mare's condition deteriorated. "We need a distraction," Jackson murmured, scanning their surroundings for options. His gaze settled on a natural drainage channel running along the eastern edge of the meadow. The rain had already transformed it into a swiftly moving stream, creating a natural barrier. "If we can draw the band away from the mare, even temporarily." Maya followed his line of thought. "The salt lick in the ATV," Jackson nodded grimly. The emergency supplies in their vehicle included compressed mineral blocks specifically formulated to attract equines. Under normal circumstances, they used these to encourage nutritional supplementation among the rehabilitated Mustangs. Now, it might serve as their best chance to create the necessary separation. "I'll retrieve it," Jackson decided. "You circle around to approach the mare from the western side. Once I've drawn the band away, move in quickly. You'll have minutes at most before the stallion realizes what's happening. And if he returns while I'm with the mare..." Jackson's hand instinctively moved to the tranquilizer gun secured at his hip. "I'll manage him." The look that passed between them acknowledged the danger without needing words. They had faced challenging situations before, but never with stakes this immediate or risks so personal. Jackson squeezed Maya's shoulder briefly, a rare physical gesture from a man typically sparing with touch, before melting back into the darkness toward their vehicle. Maya circled wide through the juniper grove, careful to remain downwind of the Mustangs. The rain had intensified, reducing visibility to mere yards and turning the ground underfoot into treacherous mud. Twice she nearly lost her footing on the slick terrain, catching herself against tree trunks to prevent a fall that would generate noise and potentially alert the horses. From her new position, she had a clearer view of the mare's condition. The chestnut Mustang had managed to position herself against a slight depression in the earth, using the natural contour for support as she struggled with contractions. Even in the darkness, Maya could see the animal's sides heaving with exertion, foam flecking her muzzle, clear signs of extreme distress and fatigue. A flash of lightning briefly illuminated the entire scene, followed seconds later by a thunderous boom that seemed to shake the very ground. The Mustangs startled collectively, their heads raised in alarm. Only the mare remained down, too exhausted to respond to the perceived threat. In that moment of distraction, Maya spotted Jackson approaching from the opposite direction. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, keeping his profile low against the horizon. In one hand he carried the mineral block, in the other a small battery-powered speaker. Maya recognized the second item as part of their wildlife research equipment, typically used to broadcast recorded calls for population surveys. Jackson positioned himself at the edge of the meadow before activating the speaker. The soft nickering sound of a content mare feeding emerged from the device, barely audible to human ears at this distance, but clearly detectable to the sensitive hearing of the Mustangs. Simultaneously, he placed the mineral block on an exposed patch of ground, the rain immediately beginning to dissolve its outer layer and release the enticing scent of essential minerals desperately needed by horses surviving on drought-stressed vegetation. The reaction was immediate but not universal. 4 of the Mustangs, including the yearling colt, turned toward the sound and scent, their ears pricked forward in interest. The stallion, however, remained vigilant, positioning himself between the perceived intrusion and the vulnerable mare. He pawed the ground nervously, his nostrils flaring as he tested the air for danger. Jackson increased the volume slightly on the speaker and moved it in a slow arc away from the mare, intentionally, creating distance. The strategy was clear: draw the band away gradually rather than startle them into flight, which might cause them to take the mare with them. For several tense minutes, a silent battle of wills played out between the wild stallion and the patient veteran. Jackson remained absolutely still, except for the incremental movement of the speaker, while the stallion snorted and pranced, clearly torn between investigation and protection. Finally, the Mustang's curiosity overcame caution. He approached the mineral block cautiously, still maintaining visual contact with his band, but creating the opening Maya had been waiting for. She seized the opportunity, advancing quickly but smoothly toward the mare, while the stallion was distracted. The remaining horses shifted nervously at her approach but didn't flee, perhaps too concerned with their herdmate's condition to abandon her. The mare herself seemed barely conscious of Maya's presence, her eyes glazed with pain and exhaustion. "Easy, girl," Maya murmured, keeping her voice low and soothing as she knelt beside the struggling animal. "I'm here to help." Up close, the severity of the situation became alarmingly clear. The mare had been in active labor for too long, her strength flagging with each unproductive contraction. Maya could see just the tips of the foal's hooves presenting, but the positioning was wrong, one leg tucked back rather than extended alongside the nose as it should be. Working with swift efficiency, Maya unpacked her medical supplies, laying them out on a waterproof ground cloth. She pulled on shoulder-length obstetrical gloves and prepared a mild sedative that would relax the mare without fully anesthetizing her, a delicate balance necessary for both their safety. Complete anesthesia would require equipment they couldn't possibly manage in field conditions and would leave the mare dangerously vulnerable in the wild. "I'm going to help your baby," she whispered, administering the sedative with practiced precision. The mare flinched slightly at the injection but was too exhausted to resist. Within moments, the medication began taking effect, the animal's breathing becoming slightly less labored as her muscles relaxed. Maya glanced toward Jackson's position. He had successfully drawn most of the band several yards away, but the stallion was growing restless, repeatedly looking back toward the mare. Their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. With careful but decisive movements, Maya began the difficult process of repositioning the foal. She inserted her gloved hand and arm into the birth canal, feeling for the tucked leg that was preventing delivery. The process required both technical skill and considerable physical strength, pushing against powerful contractions while simultaneously manipulating the mal-positioned limb. The mare whinnied in discomfort despite the sedation, the sound immediately drawing the stallion's attention. He wheeled away from the mineral block, ears pinned back and eyes locked on the scene of Maya working with his mate. Jackson moved instantly, placing himself between the approaching stallion and Maya, his body language projecting the calm authority that had served him well in countless dangerous situations. "Maya," he called without turning, his voice steady. "Status?" "Almost there," she responded tersely, sweat mingling with rain on her face as she continued the delicate manipulation. "1 more minute." The stallion advanced several steps, nostrils flaring and teeth bared, a clear threat display. Jackson stood his ground, maintaining eye contact with the Mustang while slowly raising his arms to make his silhouette larger and more intimidating. He knew the tranquilizer gun was an absolute last resort. Using it would likely scatter the band and potentially separate them permanently from the mare and her soon-to-arrive foal. "Easy, brother," Jackson murmured to the stallion. "We're helping, not hurting. Stand down." Whether it was his tone, his stance, or some primal recognition between two alpha males, the stallion hesitated. He continued to paw the ground aggressively, but didn't charge. Thunder crashed overhead, momentarily breaking the standoff as the Mustang startled at the sound. "Got it!" Maya's triumphant exclamation cut through the tension. Legs repositioned. She needs help with the final push. Jackson didn't dare turn away from the stallion. "Do what you need to do. I've got this." The rain continued to pour down upon them all. The laboring mare, the protective stallion, the hovering band members, and 2 humans risking everything to save a wild creature. In that moment, species differences seemed to dissolve, replaced by a more fundamental connection. The universal struggle for survival and the instinctive drive to protect new life. Maya worked with focused intensity, years of veterinary training guiding her hands through the complex process of assisted foaling. With the leg now properly positioned, the birth could proceed, but the mare's exhaustion presented a new challenge. After hours of fruitless labor, she simply lacked the strength for the powerful contractions needed to complete delivery. "Come, on girl," Maya encouraged, applying gentle traction in rhythm with the mare's weakening efforts. "Work with me now." The mare's eyes, though glazed with fatigue, seemed to hold a glimmer of understanding. She gathered her remaining strength for another push as Maya carefully guided the foal's shoulders through the birth canal. The delicate choreography between human intervention and natural process required perfect timing. Too much force would injure both mare and foal. Too little would fail to compensate for the mother's depleted energy. 20 yards away, Jackson maintained his protective stance between the operation and the increasingly agitated stallion. The massive black Mustang paced in tight circles, occasionally rearing and striking out with his front hooves, clear signals of his mounting distress. The bond between stallion and led mare transcended simple herd dynamics. These animals often formed partnerships that lasted their entire lives. "Jackson," Maya called out, her voice tight with concentration. "The foal's coming, but I need both. Hands, can you hold position?" "Do what you need to do," he replied, without breaking eye contact with the stallion. "I'm not moving." The rain had plastered Jackson's clothing to his body, the chill seeping into old injuries and making his left leg throb where shrapnel remained embedded near the knee. He ignored the discomfort, drawing on the same mental discipline that had allowed him to endure far worse conditions during combat operations. His focus remained entirely on the stallion, reading minute shifts in the animal's body language that might telegraph an imminent charge. A particularly bright flash of lightning illuminated the entire scene in stark detail. Maya kneeling beside, the straining mare, Jackson standing firm, despite the mud threatening to swallow his boots, the band of Mustangs hovering at varying distances, and the stallion caught between protective instinct and uncertainty. For a suspended moment, it seemed as though the tableau had been frozen in time, capturing the raw intensity of the struggle unfolding. Then the moment broke as the mare released a guttural sound unlike anything they had heard before. Somewhere, between a groan and a whinny, Maya felt the final resistance give way as the foal's hips cleared the birth canal in a rush of amniotic fluid. The tiny Mustang slid into her waiting hands, its wet coat appearing nearly black in the darkness. "We have a foal," she announced, quickly clearing fluid from the newborn's nostrils and mouth. "Alive and breathing." The announcement triggered an immediate change in the stallion's demeanor. His aggressive posturing shifted to intense curiosity, his ears pricking forward and nostrils flaring to catch the scent of the new arrival. He took several cautious steps closer, causing Jackson to tense, ready to intercept if necessary. "Easy," Jackson murmured, more to himself than the horse. "Easy now." Maya worked efficiently, checking the foal's vitals while simultaneously monitoring the exhausted mare. She administered a vitamin injection to the mother and cleared the birthing membranes from the foal's face, all while keeping one eye on Jackson's standoff with the stallion. The newborn Mustang, slick with birth fluids and unsteady already, struggled to lift its head, an instinct as old as the species itself, driving it to rise despite the adversity of its entry into the world. "It's a filly," Maya called out, her professional detachment momentarily giving way to wonder. Strong heartbeat, good respiration, she's trying to get up already. A maternal nickering emerged from the mare as she twisted her neck to view her offspring. Despite her exhaustion, she began the instinctive behavior of licking the foal clean, stimulating circulation and forming the crucial early bond between mother and baby. "They need space now," Maya said, already beginning to pack her equipment. "The mare's stable, and the foal appears healthy. The most important thing is to let them bond without further interference." Jackson nodded, understanding the delicate transition required. They had achieved their immediate goal, ensuring the successful birth, but now faced the equally challenging task of withdrawing without disrupting the natural processes that would follow. The stallion would need to accept the foal, the mare would need to stand and allow nursing, and the band would need to incorporate their newest member. "Start backing away," Jackson instructed quietly. "Slow, smooth movements. I'll cover our retreat." Maya began the careful process of withdrawal, never turning her back on the horses as she created distance inch by inch. The stallion watched them intently, still maintaining his protective position but no longer displaying overt aggression. Perhaps some primal understanding had passed between species, a recognition that the strange two-legged creatures had acted not as predators but as allies in bringing new life safely into the world. As they retreated, the rest of the Mustang band gradually closed ranks around the mare and newborn, their bodies creating a living barrier against the elements. The storm that had complicated the birth now served another purpose, washing away the scent of human intervention that clung to the foal. By morning, the only evidence of their presence would be hoofprints and the healthy cry of a newborn Mustang. They maintained their backward progress until reaching the concealment of the juniper grove, finally turning to make their way through the darkness toward their observation blind. Both were soaked to the skin, covered in mud, and physically drained from the intensity of the experience. "We did it," Maya said simply, as they ducked into the relative shelter of the blind. Her hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline that had sustained her began to ebb. Jackson nodded, his weathered face softening into a rare smile. She was a fighter, mare and foal both. "Like someone else I know," Maya replied, giving him a meaningful look as she wrapped a thermal blanket around her shoulders. They settled into watchful silence, using their equipment to monitor the Mustang family from a distance as the storm gradually dissipated. The sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly in the east, hinting at approaching dawn. Through the spotting scope, they could see that the foal had successfully risen to her feet, wobbling uncertainly beside her mother. Most remarkably, the stallion had positioned himself directly beside the mare, his powerful body sheltering both her and the foal from the lingering rain. He occasionally lowered his head to nuzzle the newborn, a behavior that confirmed his acceptance of the new addition. "I've never seen anything like this," Maya whispered, her professional interest momentarily overtaken by simple wonder. After all that, he's not just accepting the foal, he's actively bonding with her. That level of stallion involvement isn't common, especially not this quickly. Jackson watched the scene with quiet appreciation. Maybe he knows they saved each other. Without our help, she might have lost the foal. Without the foal... He didn't need to finish the thought. They both understood that the drive to protect the next generation often provided strength beyond normal endurance. As full daylight gradually revealed the landscape, they could see the foal more clearly. A delicate creature with her mother's chestnut coloring, but with the stallion's white sock marking on her right foreleg. Her coat, now drying in the morning air, revealed a distinctive pattern, a perfect diamond of white on her chest, echoing the mark on her mother's forehead, but in a different location. "She's beautiful," Maya observed, her scientific detachment momentarily abandoned. Textbook confirmation, strong legs. If she survives her first year, she could grow into an exceptional mare. If they stay within the sanctuary boundaries, she'll have a chance, Jackson replied, his thoughts already turning to the practical considerations of protecting these new arrivals. The rehabilitation center's mandate didn't extend to managing truly wild herds, but perhaps exceptions could be made for Mustangs that had sought refuge on their land during extreme conditions. The filly took her first tentative steps away from her mother, exploring her new world with the curiosity that would serve her throughout life. The stallion watched attentively, immediately moving to guide her back when she strayed too far. The rest of the band maintained their protective circle, occasionally approaching to gently investigate the newcomer before returning to grazing. On the rain-refreshed vegetation, "What happens now?" Maya asked, though she already knew the answer. The center's policy was clear. Minimum intervention with wild horses unless absolutely necessary for survival. "We monitor from a distance," Jackson replied. "Make sure the mare recovers her strength, ensure the foal is nursing properly. Beyond that, they make their own way." Maya nodded, understanding the philosophy, but feeling the pull of attachment. That often complicated wildlife work. They traveled so far to get here. I wonder if they'll stay. "That's up to them," Jackson said, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "Sometimes the journey itself changes you, makes you see places differently than you might have before. This might become home for them now." As the sun broke through the dissipating clouds, illuminating the meadow in golden light, the mare rose carefully to her feet. The foal immediately positioned herself to nurse, instinctively seeking nourishment. The stallion stood guard nearby, his powerful presence ensuring their safety during this vulnerable moment. Against all odds, in the midst of drought and displacement, new life had found a way forward, guided by both wild instinct and human compassion. For the next 3 days, Jackson and Maya maintained their observation of the Mustang family, establishing a rotating schedule that allowed them to fulfill their other responsibilities at the rehabilitation center, while keeping careful watch over the new arrivals. They constructed a more permanent blind at a strategic distance, equipped with solar-powered monitoring equipment that transmitted vital data back to the center's main facility. The morning after the birth, Jackson had carefully approached the area where the foaling had occurred, methodically removing any traces of their intervention, discarded packaging from medical supplies, footprints in the mud, even the salt lick that had served as their initial distraction. The less human presence these wild Mustangs associated with their new territory, the better their chances of establishing a natural rhythm undisturbed by habituation to people. "They're adapting remarkably well," Maya noted on the afternoon of the third day, reviewing footage captured by their remote cameras overnight. The screens showed the mare, whom they had begun referring to as Diamond in their notes, grazing confidently while her foal explored increasingly wider circles. Around her, the stallion, now nicknamed Shadow, maintained vigilant patrol of their adopted territory, occasionally interacting with the other band members, but always returning to check on his mate and offspring. The foals gaining strength quickly, Jackson agreed, studying the newborn's movements with an experienced eye. Good muscle tone, coordinated gait for her age. Mare's milk production seems adequate despite her ordeal. What neither verbalized, though both recognized, was the extraordinary nature of what they were witnessing. Against tremendous odds, drought, displacement, a difficult birth, this wild family was not merely surviving, but showing signs of thriving. The filly, barely 3 days old, already displayed the characteristic spark of her heritage, prancing with innate grace during brief bursts of energy between long naps in the spring sunshine. Maya had begun collecting data for a potential research paper, meticulously documenting the band's adaptation to their new territory. The rehabilitation center had never before had the opportunity to study a completely wild Mustang group establishing territory within their boundaries. Most of their work involved horses already impacted by roundups or other human interventions. "I've been thinking," she said, closing her notebook after completing her observations. "We should name her, the foal, for the records." Jackson raised an eyebrow, his expression suggesting mild concern about emotional attachment to wild subjects. As a scientist, Maya typically adhered strictly to identification numbers rather than names for wild animals under observation. Catching his look, she clarified, "Not for sentimental reasons. For tracking purposes, especially if they remain within sanctuary boundaries long term. These are prior mountain Mustangs in a completely new territory. Their adaptation strategies could provide valuable insights for conservation efforts." Jackson considered this, then nodded. "What did you have in mind?" Maya's gaze drifted to where the filly was currently attempting her first clumsy canter, stumbling slightly before regaining her balance with remarkable resilience. "I was thinking Esperanza." Hope, Jackson translated, having picked up Spanish. During military deployments in Central America, a slight smile softened his weathered features. Fitting. The name seemed particularly appropriate given the circumstances of the foal's birth, emerging from crisis into possibility, just as Jackson himself had done after leaving military service. Though he would never have articulated the parallel, Maya recognized the resonance in his expression. They settled into comfortable silence, continuing their observations as afternoon transitioned toward evening. The rehabilitative center's other responsibilities couldn't be postponed indefinitely, however, and they had arranged for junior staff members to relieve them at dusk for the overnight monitoring shift. "We should head back," Jackson said, eventually checking his watch. "Storm system moving in from the northwest tonight. Need to secure the special needs paddocks before it hits." Maya nodded, gathering her equipment. The center currently housed 3 Mustangs requiring specialized care: an older stallion recovering from a mountain lion attack, a yearling with a congenital hoof abnormality, and a pregnant mare rescued from an illegal holding facility. Each required specific preparations before adverse weather. As they packed up their observation gear, Maya paused to take one last look at the wild band. "Do you think they'll stay? Once Diamond fully recovers her strength, they could easily move on." Jackson considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. "Hard to say. They've found water, adequate grazing, and relative safety. But wild horses follow patterns established over generations, seasonal migrations, traditional territories. This isn't their ancestral range." "But their ancestral range couldn't sustain them anymore," Maya pointed out. "That's why they made such a desperate journey in the first place." "True." Jackson shouldered his pack, wincing slightly as the weight settled against old injuries. "Nature adapts when it must. Survival often means embracing change." The philosophy seemed to reflect his personal journey as much as the Mustang's. Jackson rarely spoke about his transition from combat operations to conservation work, but Maya had pieced together enough of his history to understand the profound adaptations he'd made in his own life. Finding new purpose after witnessing destruction, choosing to protect life after being trained to end it. They made their way back to the center's main compound in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The facility came into view as they crested the final ridge. A collection of simple structures designed to blend with the natural landscape. Paddocks of various sizes housed Mustangs in different stages of rehabilitation, while the medical barn, equipment sheds, and staff quarters formed a rough semicircle around a central courtyard. Ellie Chen, one of their most promising junior staff members, approached as they reached the main gate. Her expression conveyed both excitement and concern. "We've got visitors," she announced without preamble. "Bureau of Land Management officials. They arrived about an hour ago, asking about reports of a new Mustang band in the North Sector." Jackson and Maya exchanged glances. The BLM's relationship with wild horse conservation organizations was complicated at best, adversarial at worst. The federal agency was tasked with managing both public lands and the wild horses that inhabited them, often resulting in controversial roundup operations when populations were deemed too large for available resources. "What did you tell them?" Jackson asked, his voice neutral, but his posture subtly shifting into the straight-backed alertness that emerged whenever he faced potential conflict. "Just that we were aware of Mustang activity along the northern boundary and had established observation protocols, as with any wildlife entering the sanctuary," Ellie replied. "They want to speak with you specifically. Something about herd management plans for the drought response." Maya frowned slightly. The drought's pushing multiple bands into new territories. If they're planning emergency roundups, she didn't need to finish the thought. Emergency gatherings during foaling season could be devastating for new mothers and their offspring, often resulting in separation, injury, or worse. The very interventions intended to save horses from drought starvation sometimes created different, equally serious threats to their welfare. "Where are they now?" Jackson asked, his expression unreadable. "Conference room. Lisa's keeping them occupied with coffee and paperwork." "Good. Give us 10 minutes to clean up, then we'll meet them." As Ellie departed to relay the message, Maya turned to Jackson. "What's our position going to be? Technically, this band crossed onto sanctuary land without formal BLM transfer approval." Jackson considered, his military training evident in how quickly he assessed strategic options. "We document everything from first observation, their condition upon arrival, evidence of drought impact, the complicated birth requiring emergency intervention. Position it as a temporary sanctuary for Mustangs in crisis rather than permanent acquisition. And if they want to remove them, Esperanza's not even a week old." Maya rarely allowed emotional attachment to influence her professional judgment, but the circumstances of this birth had affected her deeply. "One step at a time," Jackson counseled. Let's hear what they're proposing first. 20 minutes later, freshly changed and armed with their detailed observation records, they entered the conference room where two BLM representatives waited. Jackson recognized the senior official, Robert Sanderson, Regional Director for Wild Horse and Burro Management. They had crossed paths during multiple policy forums over the years, occasionally finding common ground despite representing different approaches to wild horse conservation. "Jackson," Sanderson greeted him with a firm handshake. "Been a while." "Robert," Jackson acknowledged with a slight nod. "What brings BLM to our corner of Montana? Bit far from your usual territory." "Droughts scrambling everything," Sanderson replied, gesturing toward the map spread across the conference table. Red markings indicated severely impacted wild horse territories across multiple states. "We're tracking displaced bands, trying to develop coordinated response strategies before winter." His younger colleague, introduced as technical specialist Andrea Morris, added, "Satellite tracking shows at least 7 bands have moved significant distances from their traditional ranges. The Pryor Mountain herd is particularly concerning. We've documented 3 separate groups that have traveled over 50 miles seeking water and grazing." Maya laid their observation log on the table. "One of those groups found its way here. 6 Mustangs, including a heavily pregnant mare who gave birth 3 days ago under difficult circumstances." Sanderson's expression registered surprise. "You have a new foal. That complicates matters." "Complicated them already," Jackson stated flatly. "Mare required emergency assistance during delivery. Both survived, but they're in a critical bonding period. Any disruption now would significantly threaten their welfare." Morris consulted her tablet. "Our records don't show any authorized Mustang acquisition for your facility in the past 6 months. What's your legal status with these animals?" The question carried bureaucratic weight that could determine the band's fate. Unauthorized possession of wild horses, even by a licensed rehabilitation facility, could trigger removal orders. However, emergency welfare interventions operated under different protocols. Jackson met her gaze steadily. "We didn't acquire them. They sought refuge during environmental distress, and we provided emergency medical intervention under Section 4.7 of the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act provisions for imminent welfare threat. All fully documented from initial observation through medical necessity." He slid their comprehensive records across the table, including time-stamped photographs documenting the mare's condition upon arrival and the complicated birth. Years of navigating federal regulations had taught him the value of meticulous documentation. Sanderson reviewed the materials with the practiced eye of someone who had seen countless wild horse cases. After several minutes, he looked up with reluctant acknowledgement. "Your intervention was justified under emergency provisions. The question now is what happens next." "Our recommendation is clear," Maya stated professionally, though Jackson could hear the underlying passion in her voice. "The band should remain under observation within sanctuary boundaries until both mare and foal are sufficiently recovered for any potential relocation. Given drought conditions in their original territory, forced return would constitute a secondary welfare threat." Morris frowned slightly. "The rehabilitation center isn't zoned for permanent wild herd maintenance. Your permits cover temporary rehabilitation with either release to federal lands or transfer to adoption programs." "Which is why we're not proposing permanent residence," Jackson countered smoothly. "We're proposing temporary sanctuary until conditions allow for appropriate relocation. Could be months, could be longer depending on climate conditions. The critical factor is maintaining family band integrity during recovery. The emphasis on family structures wasn't accidental. Recent BLM policy revisions had begun acknowledging the importance of Mustang social bonds in relocation decisions, moving away from older practices that separated bands during processing. Sanderson leaned back in his chair, studying Jackson with something approaching respect. "You've always been good at finding the regulatory middle ground, Reeves. What exactly are you proposing?" "Joint monitoring program," Jackson replied without hesitation. "The band remains within our northern sector under BLM and rehabilitation, center observation. We provide regular health assessments, you provide drought impact data. Together, we develop appropriate long-term placement once the foal reaches suitable age for safe travel. Minimum 6 months, preferably 12. And you have resources to support additional animals for that duration?" Morris asked, looking skeptical. Maya nodded firmly. "We've already secured emergency drought funding from the Wild Horse Conservancy. Water access isn't an issue within our boundaries, and our hay reserves are sufficient through winter." What followed was 2 hours of detailed negotiation, reviewing maps, regulations, and resource allocations. Throughout, Jackson maintained the calm, resolute approach that had served him through both military conflicts and conservation battles. When the discussion concluded, they had hammered out a provisional agreement. The Mustang band would remain under rehabilitation center care with joint BLM monitoring for a minimum of 8 months, after which their situation would be reassessed based on both their welfare and drought conditions in their original territory. As the BLM officials gathered their materials to depart, Sanderson paused beside Jackson. "You know, in 30 years, with the Bureau, I've seen just about every approach to wild horse management. Some people want them all rounded up and domesticated. Others think we should never intervene, even when they're starving. Your middle path isn't easy." Jackson nodded, slightly, understanding the unspoken acknowledgement. Nothing worthwhile ever is. Over the following weeks, the rehabilitation center settled into a new routine that incorporated monitoring of the wild Mustang band alongside their regular operations. Jackson had designated a specific area in the northern sector as protected territory, instructing all staff to maintain minimum observation distances and restrict visits to essential personnel only. Maya developed a comprehensive health monitoring protocol that allowed them to assess the band's condition without direct interference, using high-powered optics and periodic drone surveys conducted at elevations that wouldn't disturb the horses. The filly they had named Esperanza thrived despite her difficult entry into the world. By her 3rd week, she was galloping confidently alongside her mother, her gangly legs showing the first signs of the powerful musculature that would eventually develop. Her chestnut coat gleamed in the summer sunshine, the white diamond on her chest becoming more pronounced as her baby fuzz gave way to her adult coat. Diamond, the mare, had fully recovered from the birth, her body regaining strength as she grazed. On the rehabilitation center's protected meadows, the scratch on Shadow's flank had healed completely, leaving a barely visible line of white hairs that would eventually blend with his glossy black coat. Most remarkably, the entire band appeared to be adapting to their new territory, establishing regular patterns of movement between water sources and favored grazing areas. On a warm June morning, Jackson stood at the perimeter of the observation zone, binoculars raised as he conducted his weekly assessment. The Mustangs had established a routine that brought them to this particular meadow during early daylight hours, attracted by the mix of native grasses that flourished here. He noted each animal's condition on a tablet, documenting weight estimates, coat quality, and behavioral indicators. Maya approached quietly, having completed her rounds with the rehabilitation center's resident Mustangs. She carried 2 travel mugs of coffee, handing one to Jackson without interrupting his observation. "They've gained weight," he noted without lowering the binoculars. "All of them. Even the yearling colt is filling out nicely." Maya nodded, sipping her coffee. "Blood samples from the water trough confirm no parasitic concerns, and their scat analysis shows excellent nutritional uptake. They found exactly what they needed here. Neither spoke the obvious follow-up. What would happen when their temporary sanctuary arrangement inevitably ended? The agreement with the BLM had secured their immediate future, but drought conditions in the Pryor Mountains had only worsened over the summer months. The band's original territory might remain inhospitable for years, creating a complicated situation for long-term management. Esperanza's growing fast, Maya observed, focusing her own binoculars on the filly who was currently engaged in what appeared to be a game of her own invention, running in tight circles around her mother before darting off to investigate something in the grass, then repeating the process. Her conformation is exceptional. Classic Spanish Mustang bloodlines, minimal evidence of crossbreeding. Jackson lowered his binoculars, a slight frown creasing his weathered features. Been meaning to ask, how's the genetic testing coming? After securing the agreement with the BLM, they had initiated a non-invasive genetic study of the band, collecting hair samples from areas where the Mustangs rested and comparing DNA markers with the database of known wild horse populations. The research served multiple purposes: documenting the band's lineage for conservation records, assessing genetic diversity, and potentially strengthening their case for keeping the family together during any future management decisions. Results. "Who came back yesterday," Maya replied, her expression carefully neutral. "They're definitely Pryor Mountain Mustangs, primarily Spanish colonial lineage with minimal draft horse influence. What's interesting is that Diamond shows genetic markers from a specific bloodline that was thought to have died out in the main herd about 15 years ago." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Conservation significance? Potentially substantial. If she represents a remnant of that bloodline, her foal could be genetically valuable for maintaining diversity in the broader population." Maya hesitated before continuing. "I've drafted a preliminary report for the Wild Horse Conservancy suggesting a modified management approach. Rather than eventual return to their original territory, we could make a case for establishing them as a satellite conservation herd here under protected status. The proposal was ambitious. Transitioning from temporary drought refuge to permanent conservation status would require navigating complex federal regulations and securing additional funding. However, the genetic findings provided scientific justification that might sway both bureaucratic and financial considerations. Jackson considered the implications, his military-trained mind automatically assessing potential challenges and strategies. BLM's already stretched thin, managing existing herds. Adding a new designated conservation area would trigger environmental impact studies, public comment periods, resource allocation reviews, all of which take time, Maya pointed out. Time during which they remain here, where we know they're thriving, where Esperanza can grow up in stable conditions with her family intact. The unspoken subtext hung between them. Their professional commitment to wild horse welfare occasionally conflicted with the realities of federal land management policies. Roundups, separations, and relocations remained common practices despite mounting evidence of their detrimental effects on Mustang social structures and psychological well-being. Jackson's response was interrupted by the vibration of his phone. He glanced at the screen, frowning slightly. Supply trucks arrived. They're having trouble with the hay delivery. "Go," Maya said. "I'll finish the observation log." As Jackson departed, Maya returned her attention to the Mustang band, focusing particularly on the interactions between Shadow and Esperanza. While stallions typically maintained protective roles rather than nurturing ones, Shadow displayed unusually attentive behavior toward the foal, allowing her to rest beneath him during hot afternoon hours, gently herding her away from potential hazards and occasionally engaging in brief play behaviors typically reserved for interactions between mares and their offspring. Maya documented these observations meticulously, recognizing their significance for understanding wild horse family dynamics. Her academic training had emphasized objective distance, but she couldn't help feeling privileged to witness the complex social bonds developing in this small band that had overcome such tremendous odds. When she returned to the main compound 2 hours later, she found unexpected commotion. Additional vehicles were parked near the administration building, including a news van from the regional television station. Two unfamiliar men in business attire stood talking with Jackson near the entrance, their body language suggesting an intense discussion. Lisa, the center's administrative coordinator, intercepted Maya before she could approach. "State Senator's office," she explained in a low voice, nodding toward the visitors. "Apparently someone tipped them off about our Mustang situation. They're framing it as a human interest story. Veteran saves wild horse family and want to do a feature." Maya's immediate reaction was concern. "We've been deliberately limiting exposure to minimize human habituation. A media circus is the last thing those horses need." "Jackson's pushing back," Lisa assured her. "But the senator's office is hinting at potential funding support if they can showcase the center's work. You know how tight our budget's been since the federal grants got reduced. The rehabilitation center operated on a combination of government grants, private donations, and foundation support, all perpetually insufficient for their expanding mission. Recent federal budget realignments had reduced their primary funding source by nearly 20%, forcing difficult decisions about program priorities and staffing levels." "What's the proposed angle?" Maya asked, already calculating potential risks and benefits. "Human interest conservation story. Veteran who served his country now serving wild heritage, dramatic rescue of mare and foal, scientific importance of preserving genetic diversity." Lisa shrugged slightly. "Pretty much writes itself from a PR perspective." Maya watched as Jackson concluded his conversation with the visitors and approached, his expression carefully composed, but tension evident in the set of his shoulders. "Senator Williams' office," he confirmed before she could ask. "They've gotten wind of our emergency intervention with Diamond and want to feature it as part of a broader piece on drought impacts and conservation efforts. Williams sits on the Natural Resources Committee. Could be helpful for securing long-term protection, or it could be political theater that disrupts the band's adaptation," Maya countered. "We've been painstakingly minimizing human exposure. Media cameras, crews, additional visitors, all increase habituation risks." Jackson nodded, acknowledging her concern. "Which is why I've proposed strict conditions. No direct approach to the Mustangs, filming only from established observation blinds, limited personnel, and advance approval of all content to ensure it promotes responsible wildlife interaction." The pragmatic compromise was characteristic of his approach, balancing the center's need for financial and political support against their primary mission of animal welfare. Years in both military and conservation fields had taught him that ideological purity rarely achieved practical objectives. Sometimes advancing the greater mission required tactical compromises. "When?" Maya asked, recognizing from his tone that he had already made the decision. "Preliminary filming next week. Feature to air in conjunction with a fundraising initiative for drought-impacted wild horse programs statewide." He met her gaze directly. "I don't like it either, Maya, but we need to think long-term. If this helps secure permanent protection for Diamond's band and additional resources for other drought-displaced Mustangs." He didn't need to finish the thought. They both understood the delicate balance between immediate welfare concerns and the broader strategic objectives of wild horse conservation. One band's story, properly told, might generate the public support necessary to improve conditions for thousands of Mustangs throughout the region. "I want to review all filming plans," Maya stipulated, her professional instincts asserting themselves. "Specific locations, timing, equipment, Everything needs to be assessed for potential impact on the band's behavior. Already arranged, Jackson assured her. Nothing happens without your sign-off on the wildlife welfare aspects. The following days brought intensive preparation, with Maya developing detailed protocols for the media visit, while Jackson coordinated with the senator's office to ensure all parties understood the restrictions. The center's small staff worked additional hours to prepare the facility for public exposure, repairing weathered signage and organizing educational materials that explained their approach to wild horse rehabilitation. On the morning of the scheduled filming, Maya rose before dawn to conduct a preliminary assessment of the Mustang band's location. If they happened to be far from the designated observation areas, the entire event would need to be rescheduled, a contingency she had made clear to all involved parties. Wild animals wouldn't perform on cue, and any attempt to manipulate their movements for camera convenience would violate the center's core principles. To her relief, pre-dawn reconnaissance located the band in one of their regular grazing areas, approximately half a mile from the primary observation blind. With appropriate telephoto equipment, the news crew could capture footage without disturbing the Mustang's natural behavior. She radioed this information to Jackson, who was coordinating the visitors' arrival, then settled into the blind to document the band's pre-filming behavior as a baseline for comparison. Through her spotting scope, Maya watched as Esperanza nursed, briefly before engaging in her morning burst of energetic play. At 7 weeks old, the filly had developed remarkable coordination, executing perfect rollbacks and sliding stops that would have impressed professional trainers. These maneuvers weren't learned, but instinctive. Generations of Mustang adaptations, encoded in her DNA and emerging naturally as her body developed. Shadow maintained his typical vigilant patrol of the perimeter, occasionally pausing to graze, but primarily focused on scanning for potential threats. His behavior had evolved over their weeks in the sanctuary, transitioning from the hypervigilance of their arrival to a more measured watchfulness. He still positioned himself between perceived disturbances and the band, but his threat responses had diminished in intensity, a sign of adaptation to their safer environment. The sound of approaching vehicles drew Maya's attention away from the Mustangs. 3 SUVs moved slowly along the access road, maintaining the reduced speed required within sanctuary boundaries. They parked at the designated staging area, a quarter-mile from the observation blind to minimize noise disturbance. Through binoculars, Maya identified Jackson's tall figure directing the new arrivals, his body language conveying both welcome and caution. The news crew consisted of 5 people: a reporter, camera person, sound technician, producer, and assistant. Accompanying them were 2 representatives from Senator Williams' office and the senator himself, a somewhat surprising development that hadn't been included in the original arrangements. Jackson led them through a briefing area where Lisa had set up educational displays about wild horse conservation and the specific challenges of drought displacement. After nearly an hour of preliminary interviews and background filming around the education center, Jackson led a carefully selected subset of the group toward the observation blind, only the core news team and the senator, leaving the additional staff behind to minimize impact. Maya noted with approval that Jackson had insisted they all change into neutral-colored clothing provided by the center, replacing bright shirts and reflective accessories with muted tones that would be less visible to the Mustang's sensitive vision. "Dr. Cooper," the reporter greeted her in a carefully modulated whisper as they entered the blind. "James Harrington, KMTN News, thank you for allowing us this opportunity." Maya acknowledged him with a brief nod, her attention primarily focused on monitoring the Mustangs for any signs of disturbance. "The band is approximately 400 yards northeast," she informed them quietly. "They've been in this meadow since dawn and will likely remain until the heat of midday drives them towards shade near the creek. Your cameraman can set up here." She indicated the specially designed port that allowed filming without creating a visible or scent profile outside the blind. Senator Williams, a man in his early 60s with the practiced charm of a career politician, extended his hand. "Doctor, I've heard remarkable things about your work here. The genetic preservation aspects particularly interest me. My constituency includes several communities historically connected to these Mustang bloodlines." Maya provided concise explanations as the news crew set up their equipment, emphasizing the scientific and conservation significance rather than dramatizing the intervention. When questioned specifically about the birth, she focused on the physiological aspects and broader implications for drought management rather than personifying the animals. Jackson joined them after ensuring the remaining visitors were settled. In the education center, he positioned himself slightly apart, observing both the Mustangs through the viewing ports and the human dynamics within the blind. His expression remained neutral, but Maya recognized the subtle indicators of his hypervigilance. The way his attention systematically swept their surroundings, the slight tension in his posture, the positioning that gave him clear sightlines to all participants. The interview progressed professionally, with Harrington demonstrating genuine understanding of conservation issues rather than merely seeking sensationalistic angles. He asked informed questions about drought impacts, genetic diversity in isolated populations, and the balance between non-intervention philosophies and welfare considerations. "Mr. Reeves," he eventually asked, turning to Jackson, "as a veteran who served overseas and now works in wildlife conservation, do you see connections between your military experience and your current mission?" The question clearly caught Jackson off guard. He rarely discussed his service background in professional contexts, preferring to maintain separation between his past and present work. A moment of silence stretched as he considered his response. "Both require recognizing what you can control and what you can't," he finally answered, his voice measured. "In combat operations, you learn quickly that perfect solutions don't exist, only workable ones under difficult circumstances. Wildlife conservation isn't so different. You make the best decisions possible with limited information, adapt when conditions change, and never lose sight of the primary mission." "And what is the mission here?" Harrington pressed. Jackson's gaze shifted to the meadow, where Shadow stood vigilant while Diamond grazed peacefully, and Esperanza explored her world with boundless curiosity. "To protect what matters," he said simply. "To ensure these living connections to our past have a place in our future." The answer seemed to resonate with both the reporter and the senator, who nodded appreciatively. The cameraman continued filming the Mustangs through the specialized port, capturing footage of their natural behaviors undisturbed by human presence. As the interview concluded and the group prepared to return to the main facility, a sudden commotion erupted from the meadow. Shadow had detected something beyond human perception, his head raised high and ears pricked forward in alarm. The other band members immediately responded to his warning, clustering together with Esperanza protected. "In the center, what's happening?" the senator asked, concern evident in his voice. Maya adjusted her spotting scope, scanning the perimeter of the meadow. "Possible predator?" she murmured, her experienced eye searching for the cause of the Mustang's alarm. "Mountain lion territory overlaps with this sector." The cameraman swiftly redirected his equipment, recognizing the potential for dramatic footage. Jackson's hand settled firmly on the camera, gently but decisively pushing it down. "We don't film potential distress," he stated quietly but firmly. "If there's a predator situation developing, our priority is monitoring for potential intervention needs, not documentation." To his credit, Harrington immediately backed Jackson's position. "Of course, Kyle, pack up the gear. We've got more than enough footage." The news crew and senator departed quickly and quietly under Jackson's firm guidance, leaving Maya alone, in the observation blind, to monitor the developing situation. Through her spotting scope, she tracked Shadow's increasingly agitated movements as he positioned himself between his band and whatever threat he had detected. Diamond herded Esperanza and the other Mustangs into a tight formation, ready to flee. At his signal, Maya reached for the radio clipped to her belt. "Jackson, I've got escalating protective behavior from Shadow. Still can't visual confirm the threat, but it's coming from the northwest edge of the meadow, near the rock outcropping." "Copy that," Jackson's voice crackled back. "I'm getting our visitors clear of the area. Do we need emergency response protocols?" She studied the Mustang's behavior carefully before responding. Years of field observation had taught her to differentiate between various levels of equine alarm responses. Not yet. They're alert but not panicking. Shadow's in assessment mode, not immediate flight. "Understood. Visitors are loaded up and moving out. I'm heading back with the ATV and Predator kit. ETA 7 minutes. Maya continued her methodical scan of the meadow perimeter, finally spotting movement in the tall grass near a rocky ledge approximately 200 yards from the Mustang band. The tawny coat of a mountain lion blended nearly perfectly with the drought-yellowed vegetation, but its slow, deliberate stalk was unmistakable to a trained observer. Mountain lion encounters weren't uncommon in the rehabilitation center's territory. The sanctuary's healthy prey populations occasionally attracted these apex predators, creating complex management challenges. While natural predation was an integral part of wild ecosystems, the center's mandate to protect recovering Mustang populations sometimes necessitated intervention in specific circumstances. Maya documented the cat's position and movements, noting that it appeared to be a young adult male, likely in the process of establishing territory after separation from his mother. Its hunting focus seemed directed toward the band's yearling colt rather than Esperanza, a logical target selection for a predator not yet at full size and strength. Shadow clearly sensed the approaching danger, maintaining position between the mountain lion and his band, while periodically issuing low, warning snorts. The stallion pawed the ground aggressively, sending clear signals of his willingness to defend rather than flee. An unusual choice that reflected both his protective nature and the band's limited familiarity with escape routes in this new territory. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with the mountain lion freezing whenever Shadow displayed aggressive posturing, then resuming its cautious approach when the stallion's attention momentarily shifted. The predator's patience and strategy revealed the complex calculus of wild hunting, conserving energy, minimizing risk of injury, and identifying the precise moment when opportunity outweighed danger. Maya heard the low rumble of the ATV's engine before she spotted Jackson approaching along the maintenance trail that bordered the meadow's eastern edge. He had positioned himself intentionally to enter the scenario from a direction that wouldn't drive the mountain lion toward the Mustangs or startle the band into running toward the predator. His arrival changed the dynamic immediately. The mountain lion, already weighing the risks of confronting a protective stallion, now had an additional variable to assess. It slunk lower in the grass, its attention divided between the Mustangs and this new potential threat. Jackson stopped the ATV at a calculated distance and dismounted deliberately, moving with the measured confidence of someone who understood predator psychology. He carried a specialized kit containing non-lethal deterrents, compressed air horns, strobe lights, and targeted sound devices designed to discourage predators without causing lasting harm. Maya maintained her position, continuing to document the interaction while preparing to provide tactical information if needed. Through her earpiece, she heard Jackson's quiet voice. Visual confirmation on the cat. northwest quadrant, using the rock outcropping as cover. Young adult male appears to be targeting the yearling. Shadow's holding defensive position but hasn't charged. Band is clustered near the east meadow entrance, ready for flight. Copy that. I'm going to create a deterrent barrier, give them an exit corridor to the east sanctuary. What followed was a masterclass in wildlife management. Rather than directly threatening the mountain lion, which might trigger either an attack response or send it charging through the Mustang band in panic, Jackson began systematically, creating a sensory boundary along the western edge of the meadow. He deployed a series of specialized devices at strategic intervals, establishing what amounted to an invisible fence that would encourage the predator to retreat in the opposite direction from the horses. The mountain lion's initial reaction was to freeze, assessing this new development. When Jackson activated the first sound deterrent, emitting frequencies specifically calibrated to discourage feline predators without affecting equines, the cat visibly flinched, its ears flattening against its skull. Shadow, meanwhile, seemed to intuitively understand the changing dynamics. Rather than maintaining his fixed defensive position, he began maneuvering his band incrementally toward the eastern meadow exit, away from both the mountain lion and Jackson's activities. The stallion's strategic movements revealed a level of situation assessment that transcended mere instinct, demonstrating the complex decision-making capabilities that had enabled Mustangs to survive for centuries in challenging environments. The mountain lion made one final calculation of risk versus reward before slinking backward into denser cover, unwilling to pursue its hunt against mounting obstacles. It didn't flee in panic, but made a controlled tactical retreat, preserving energy and simply deferring the hunt rather than abandoning it entirely. Maya continued tracking its movement through her spotting scope. Cats withdrawing northwest, maintaining cover. No signs of circling or renewed approach. Copy that, Jackson replied. I'll maintain position until the band clears the meadow. The Mustangs moved with coordinated precision toward the eastern exit, Shadow repeatedly turning, to ensure all members were together while Diamond kept Esperanza close to her side. Within minutes, they had disappeared into the protective tree line that bordered the meadow, heading toward one of their established safe zones near the central creek. Only when they had completely withdrawn did Jackson begin collecting his deterrent equipment. His movements remained deliberate and unhurried, avoiding any behaviors that might be interpreted as pursuit by either the retreating mountain lion or the Mustang band observing from a distance. When he returned to the observation, blind, Maya was completing her detailed documentation of the encounter. Textbook predator management, she commented, genuine admiration evident beneath her professional tone. Non-confrontational barrier establishment with controlled withdrawal opportunities for both species. Jackson nodded in acknowledgement of the compliment, but seemed preoccupied as he stored the equipment in specialized compartments on the ATV. Cat was young, inexperienced, probably pushed into new hunting territory by the drought. Same story as our Mustangs. Everyone's territory is shifting. It'll be back, Maya noted. Not immediately, but eventually. That yearling represented a significant potential meal. I know. We'll need to adjust monitoring protocols, especially during dawn and dusk hunting hours. Jackson paused, his expression thoughtful. How did Diamond and Shadow respond when we assisted with the birth? Any signs of recognition during this incident? The question revealed the underlying concern that had been forming in his mind. Direct intervention during the birth had been necessary, but created the potential for problematic associations between humans and safety that could undermine the wild band's natural wariness. Maya considered carefully before responding. No direct correlation that I could observe. They acknowledged your presence, but maintained appropriate distance. No approach behaviors or protection seeking. Shadow's defensive positioning was oriented toward the predator threat specifically, not toward potential human assistance. Good, Jackson said with evident relief. Last thing we need is for them to start seeing us as their defenders rather than maintaining natural caution. The delicate balance between necessary intervention and maintaining wild behaviors represented one of the central philosophical challenges of their work. Every human interaction, no matter how well-intentioned, carried the risk of altering natural behavior patterns that had evolved over countless generations. The Rehabilitation Center's core mission was to preserve wildness while preventing suffering, objectives that occasionally created complex ethical dilemmas. As they prepared to return to the main compound, Maya's phone signaled an incoming message. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting to surprise. The news station already uploaded a preliminary segment online. It's getting significant traction, over 10,000 shares in the first hour. Jackson raised an eyebrow. That was fast. What angle did they take? Maya skimmed the content quickly, primarily focused on the drought displacement and conservation genetics aspects, framed around the Veteran Saves Wild Horse Family human interest angle. They're highlighting the band's journey and successful adaptation after intervention. She continued reading, then looked up with a slight smile. Senator Williams is already citing our work as justification for his proposed Drought Wildlife Relief Act. Looks like your strategic compromise paid off. The legislation had been circulating in draft form for months, aimed at providing emergency funding for wildlife affected by increasingly severe climate conditions across western states. If passed, it would establish more flexible management protocols during environmental crises and allocate substantial resources for temporary relocation programs. Let's see if political interest translates to actual policy change, Jackson replied, his natural pragmatism tempering optimism. In the meantime, we focus on what we can control, keeping our Mustang family safe and documenting everything for the scientific record. When they returned to the center's main compound, they found the atmosphere charged with unusual excitement. Staff members gathered around computer screens in the research lab while Lisa handled a seemingly endless stream of incoming calls. "What's happening?" Maya asked as they entered. Ellie looked up from her computer, her expression animated. "The story's gone viral. Major networks have picked it up from the local affiliate. We've had donation pledges totaling over $30,000 in the past 2 hours, and 3 major conservation foundations have requested partnership proposals." Jackson and Maya exchanged surprised glances. The Rehabilitation Center typically operated in relative obscurity, their work known primarily within specialized conservation circles rather than the general public. Senator Williams issued a statement. "Calling you American heroes preserving our Western heritage," Lisa added, handing them printouts of the media coverage. "His office is requesting follow-up interviews and site visits for potential donors." Jackson scanned the materials with a mixture of wariness and strategic assessment. Public attention brought both opportunities and challenges. Potential funding and political support balanced against the risks of commercializing their scientific mission or creating excessive disturbance for the animals under their care. "We need to channel this properly," he decided, years of leadership experience evident in his measured response. "Media relations protocol goes into effect immediately. All inquiries filtered through Lisa, strict messaging guidelines, no additional access to the northern sector where the band is located." The staff nodded in understanding, familiar with the center's established procedures for handling periodic surges in public interest. "Maya, can you draft an appropriate scientific briefing that emphasizes conservation genetics and drought adaptations rather than the rescue narrative? We need to redirect focus toward the broader implications rather than personalizing individual animals." "Already working on it," she confirmed, recognizing the need to shape the emerging narrative around their actual mission rather than allowing it to become simplified into a dramatic rescue story. As the afternoon progressed, the scope of public's response continued to expand. Conservation organizations issued statements of support, celebrity environmentalists shared the story with their followers, and wildlife advocacy groups highlighted the situation as an example of climate change impacts on iconic western species. By evening, the Rehabilitation Center's website had crashed twice from traffic overload, prompting emergency measures to transfer their digital presence to servers capable of handling the unexpected volume. Donation pledges had surpassed $100,000, nearly a quarter of their annual operating budget, with indications of major foundation interest in providing matching grants. Jackson retreated to his office to manage the escalating situation, coordinating with their board of directors while establishing clear boundaries for media engagement. Maya focused on developing scientifically accurate briefing materials that would redirect public interest toward the broader conservation issues rather than sensationalizing the intervention. When they finally convened for an emergency staff meeting, at dusk, the implications of their sudden prominence were becoming clearer. The Rehabilitation Center had been thrust into a national spotlight that offered both unprecedented opportunities and serious risks to their mission. "Here's where we stand," Jackson informed the assembled team, his military background evident. In the clear, organized briefing style, we have an opportunity to significantly advance wild horse conservation awareness and funding. We also have a responsibility to ensure this attention doesn't compromise our core work or the welfare of the animals in our care. He outlined a comprehensive strategy for managing the situation, designating specific staff members as media contacts, establishing controlled visitor protocols, developing educational materials that broadened focus beyond the single Mustang family, and implementing enhanced security measures around the northern sector to prevent unauthorized approaches to the wild band. Most importantly, he emphasized, we maintain absolute scientific integrity, no embellishment, no anthropomorphizing, no oversimplification of complex issues. We use this platform to educate about genuine conservation challenges, not to create wildlife celebrities. The team dispersed to implement these directives, leaving Jackson and Maya alone in the conference room. For a moment, neither spoke, both processing the extraordinary developments that had transformed their quiet scientific work into a matter of public fascination. "I never expected this level of response," Maya finally said, gesturing toward the stack of media reports and social media analytics. "People are connecting with this story in ways I wouldn't have predicted." Jackson nodded thoughtfully. "People need something hopeful right now. Climate news is consistently bleak. Political divisions seem insurmountable. A story about different species working together to save a new life offers something different." "Is that how you see what happened?" Maya asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Different species cooperating? He considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. "I see adaptation. The mare accepted intervention she would normally flee from because survival required it. We modified our typical protocols because circumstances demanded it. The mountain lion adjusted its hunting strategy when conditions changed." Adaptation is how survival happens for all species. The philosophy reflected Jackson's own journey, from combat soldier to conservation leader, from battlefield traumatic experiences to healing connection with wild spaces. His life embodied the very adaptation he described, finding new purpose and different expressions of the protective instinct that had always defined him. "The real test starts tomorrow," Maya noted, returning to immediate practicalities. Senator Williams' office confirmed he's bringing potential major donors for a controlled visit. How do we balance opportunity against disturbance risks? We set absolute boundaries, Jackson replied without hesitation. Observation only from established blinds, limited numbers, strict time constraints, no exceptions, regardless of potential donation amounts. And we redirect focus toward our broader mission: drought response protocols, genetic preservation initiatives, rehabilitation methodologies, rather than treating this band as exhibits. Maya nodded in agreement, appreciating as always his unwavering prioritization of animal welfare above political or financial considerations. Their compatibility as colleagues stemmed largely from this shared value system, though their approaches sometimes differed. "I've been thinking about Esperanza's future," she said after a moment. "If this attention secures the funding and political support we need, we might actually establish permanent sanctuary status for their territory. She could grow up truly wild, but protected." The possibility represented their ideal outcome: preservation of natural behaviors and family bonds, while ensuring sufficient resources and territory for sustainable existence. It would require navigating complex regulatory frameworks and establishing new precedents for wild horse management during climate crises, but the current spotlight offered leverage they had never before possessed. "One day at a time," Jackson cautioned, though the slight softening of his expression revealed his own investment in this vision. "Tomorrow, we manage visitors and messaging. We continue monitoring the band's adaptation and security. We document everything scientifically. The rest will follow if we maintain course." As they prepared to leave, Jackson paused at the window overlooking the northern meadows, where their unlikely journey had begun weeks earlier. In the fading twilight, the landscape appeared timeless: rolling grasslands meeting forested foothills. Beneath a vast Montana sky, a landscape where wild horses had run free for centuries before human borders and management policies had complicated their existence. "You know what I thought about during that birth," he said quietly, surprising Maya with the personal reflection. "How much of our work is about reversing damage, rehabilitating injured Mustangs after roundups, restoring habitat degraded by overgrazing, reintroducing behaviors lost in captivity, but out there helping that mare? That was about preserving something before it was lost, creating possibility rather than repairing harm." The distinction seemed to hold profound significance for him, perhaps reflecting his transition from military service, where he had witnessed destruction firsthand, to conservation work that offered opportunities for creation and protection. "That's why the public is responding," Maya suggested. "It's a story about saving something before it's gone, not just mourning what's already lost." Jackson nodded slightly, his gaze still fixed on the darkening landscape where somewhere, a small Mustang, family moved through ancient patterns of wild existence, carrying precious genetic legacy and adapting to a changing world, their future now unexpectedly intertwined with human awareness in ways that might ultimately ensure their survival. "Tomorrow's challenges will be waiting at dawn," he said, finally turning away from the window. "We should get some rest." As they walked together toward the staff quarters, the distant sound of a wild Mustang's call echoed across the valley, perhaps Shadow announcing his presence to the night, or Diamond communicating with her band. The sound carried ancient genetic memory in its cadence, a living connection to horses that had run free across North American plains for centuries. For those who had helped deliver Esperanza into this complicated world, that sound represented both achievement and ongoing responsibility, a reminder that interventions, however necessary, created connections that carried forward into an uncertain future where wild and human worlds would continue their complex dance of separation and intersection. The following morning arrived with a spectacular Montana sunrise, painting the eastern sky in brilliant hues of orange and crimson. Jackson had risen well before dawn, his military-ingrained habits persisting despite years of civilian life. He sat on the porch of his modest cabin with a steaming mug of black coffee, reviewing the day's complex schedule on his tablet while mentally preparing for the delicate balancing act ahead. Senator Williams would arrive with his contingent of potential donors at 10 o'clock for a carefully orchestrated tour. The Rehabilitation Center's board chairman was flying in from Denver specifically for the meeting. Simultaneously, their regular operations needed to continue uninterrupted. Medical treatments for resident Mustangs, facility maintenance, and the ongoing monitoring of Diamond's band in the northern sector. Most critically, Jackson needed to ensure that the sudden spotlight remained beneficial rather than detrimental to their mission. Years of conservation work had taught him how quickly public fascination could transform from asset to liability. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. Maya climbed the steps to his porch, carrying her own coffee mug and a folder. "Of documents. You're up early," she commented, settling into the chair beside him. "Never really sleep much before important operations," he replied with a slight shrug. "Old habits." She nodded in understanding, having grown accustomed to his pre-mission preparation rituals over their years of collaboration. "I've updated the briefing packets," she said, opening the folder to reveal professionally designed information materials. Scientific data on drought displacement patterns, genetic diversity implications, and physiological adaptations of prior mountain Mustangs. Enough substance to redirect attention from the emotional rescue narrative toward meaningful conservation issues. Jackson reviewed the documents with approval. "Good. What's our latest on the band's status?" Ellie did the dawn observation shift. They've moved to the Eastern Creek sector, approximately 2 miles from any planned visitor access points. Shadows maintained heightened vigilance since yesterday's mountain lion encounter, but no signs of unusual stress. Esperanza is showing normal development milestones for her age. The information provided reassurance that despite the media attention, the Mustang family remained safely distant from potential disturbance. Their natural movement patterns had fortunately taken them away from areas designated for the days. "Controlled visitor access. Security protocols," Jackson asked, mentally reviewing potential vulnerabilities. "Enhanced as directed. Additional staff positioned at access roads and perimeter boundaries. Drone surveillance activated over restricted areas. All visitors will be escorted continuously with no exceptions." Maya paused before adding, "The sheriff's department also contacted us. They've noticed increased traffic on the county road and offered additional patrols if needed." The local law enforcement's proactive support reflected the rehabilitation center's positive relationship with surrounding communities, a connection Jackson had deliberately cultivated since establishing the facility. Unlike many conservation organizations that sometimes found themselves at odds with local interests, he had prioritized community integration through educational programs, employment opportunities, and transparent communication. Accept their offer, he decided. Better to have additional resources available if needed. Last thing we need is well-intentioned wildlife enthusiasts trying to find that famous horse family on their own. The potential for unauthorized approaches represented a serious concern. Well-meaning but uninformed visitors might not understand the risks of habituating wild Mustangs to human presence or the importance of maintaining minimal disturbance in their territory. "I've been monitoring social media traffic," Maya added, swiping through analytics on her tablet. "The story has generated over 3 million engagements across platforms. Multiple national news outlets have requested interviews. Conservation organizations are referencing our situation in climate impact discussions. It's unprecedented for us." Jackson nodded thoughtfully. The Rehabilitation Center had always operated with a deliberately low profile, focusing on scientific methodology rather than public relations. This sudden prominence represented uncharted territory, requiring careful navigation. "We maintain control of the narrative," he stated firmly. "All media inquiries funnel through Lisa. Approved talking points only. No personification of the Mustangs. No dramatization of the intervention. No compromising scientific accuracy for emotional appeal." As they continued reviewing preparations, the compound gradually awakened around them. Staff members emerged from their quarters, equipment vehicles moved into position, and the methodical rhythm of daily operations began taking shape despite the unusual circumstances. By 9:30, final arrangements were in place for the VIP visit. The education center had been transformed into a professional presentation space, with displays highlighting the rehabilitation center's comprehensive work rather than focusing exclusively on Diamond's band. Selected observation blinds had been prepared for controlled viewing opportunities, positioned at distances that would allow glimpses of Mustang habitat without disturbing any animals currently in the area. "Senator's motorcade just passed the county line checkpoint," Lisa reported via radio. "ETA 15 minutes, 3 vehicles, 12 total visitors, including 4 potential major donors identified by their advance team." Jackson acknowledged the information and turned to Maya. "Ready?" She nodded, her professional demeanor firmly in place despite the pressure of the situation. "Absolutely." They positioned themselves at the main entrance, presenting a united front as the black SUVs pulled into the designated parking area. Senator Williams emerged from the lead vehicle, his political instincts evident in how he immediately spotted news cameras positioned near the entrance and adjusted his trajectory to ensure optimal visual framing. "Jackson Reeves," he called warmly, approaching with extended hand. "The man of the hour. America's talking about your remarkable work here." Jackson accepted the handshake with professional courtesy, while subtly redirecting attention. "Senator, welcome to the Wild Mustang Rehabilitation Center. We're a team of dedicated professionals here, and Dr. Cooper's expertise was instrumental in the successful intervention you've heard about. The calculated redirection established the scientific foundations of their work from the outset, setting appropriate expectations for the visit." As introductions continued, Jackson carefully assessed the senator's companions, particularly the potential donors whose support could significantly impact their operational capabilities. Among them was Catherine Hammond, Executive Director of the Western Conservation Trust, whose foundation controlled substantial resources dedicated to habitat preservation initiatives. Beside her stood Richard Mercer, a technology entrepreneur whose recent pivot to environmental philanthropy had generated significant attention in conservation circles. The remaining visitors included political staffers, media representatives, and 2 ranchers whose properties bordered federal Mustang management areas. An interesting inclusion that suggested the senator was building broader coalitions around his proposed legislation. "We've prepared a comprehensive overview of our operations," Jackson informed the group as they moved toward the education center. "Following that, we'll have an opportunity for controlled observation from established blinds, maintaining appropriate distances to prevent wildlife disturbance." The structured itinerary reflected Jackson's strategic approach, providing substantive information before emotional connection, establishing scientific credibility before leveraging conservation emotions. Maya led the initial presentation, delivering a masterclass in wildlife management challenges during climate crises. She methodically explained how drought conditions were forcing wild horse bands to abandon traditional territories, creating cascade effects throughout ecosystems as species competed for diminishing resources. What we witnessed with Diamond's band represents a microcosm of displacement patterns occurring throughout western states, she explained, indicating migration maps displayed on large screens. These Mustangs traveled over 70 miles from their established range, navigating unfamiliar territories while the mare was in late-stage pregnancy. an extraordinary demonstration of adaptive behavior under extreme environmental pressure. The presentation continued with detailed explanation of the genetic significance of the band, particularly Diamond's connection to bloodlines previously thought diminished in the main Pryor mountain herd. Rather than focusing solely on the dramatic birth intervention, Maya contextualized it within broader conservation frameworks, explaining how genetic diversity preservation, habitat protection, and climate adaptation strategies interconnected to form comprehensive wild horse management approaches. Jackson observed the visitors' reactions carefully, noting which aspects generated the most engagement. Senator Williams maintained the practiced attentiveness of a career politician, occasionally nodding at key points while his staff diligently took notes. The ranchers showed particular interest in drought mitigation strategies that might apply to both wild and domestic horse populations. Most encouragingly, Hammond and Mercer, the primary potential donors, asked increasingly specific questions that demonstrated genuine understanding of the complex issues rather than merely emotional connection to the rescue narrative. Following the presentation, Jackson led the group toward the first observation blind, carefully establishing behavioral expectations en route. We maintain minimal disruption protocols throughout sanctuary boundaries, he explained as they walked along designated paths. Quiet voices, controlled movements, no calls or whistles attempting to attract animals' attention. Our objective is observation without interference, the same scientific discipline we apply to all our work here. The first blind offered views of the rehabilitation center's southern meadows, where several Mustangs in various stages of recovery grazed peacefully. These were not wild horses, but animals that had been brought to the facility after injuries, or environmental emergencies rendered them temporarily unable to survive independently. Jackson explained their rehabilitation protocols, emphasizing the center's commitment to releasing recovered Mustangs to protected federal lands whenever possible. Only approximately 30% of our rehabilitation cases become permanent sanctuary residents, he noted. Those are individuals with conditions that would prevent survival in fully wild conditions. Our primary mission remains wilderness preservation rather than domestication. As they proceeded to the second observation point, Richard Mercer fell into step beside Jackson, speaking quietly enough that others couldn't overhear. "I've been reviewing your operation since the story broke," he said without preamble. "Impressive fiscal discipline, exceptionally low administrative overhead ratio, strong scientific output metrics. You're running this place like a startup, focusing on maximum impact rather than organizational growth." The assessment reflected Mercer's business background and suggested he had conducted substantial due diligence rather than responding purely to media narratives. Jackson recognized the approach of a serious potential supporter rather than a casual donor seeking emotional gratification. "Conservation work requires efficient resource utilization," Jackson replied simply. "Every dollar diverted to unnecessary overhead is habitat not protected, research not conducted, animals not saved." Mercer nodded with evident approval. "My foundation typically focuses on technological solutions to environmental challenges. AI-driven wildlife monitoring systems, advanced genetic preservation techniques, climate adaptation innovations. But I'm increasingly convinced that direct habitat protection requires equal priority, particularly for species with specific territorial requirements like wild horses." The conversation continued as they reached the eastern observation blind, which offered distant views of the watershed area where Diamond's band had been spotted earlier that morning. Through high-powered spotting scopes, visitors could see the general landscape features without specific visibility of any Mustangs currently in the area, a deliberate limitation designed to prevent disturbance while still conveying the ecological context of their habitat, Senator Williams positioned himself beside Catherine Hammond, the Conservation Trust Director, gesturing expansively toward the landscape. "This is exactly the type of operation my Drought Wildlife Relief Act would support," he stated with political assurance. "Emergency relocation protocols, temporary sanctuary designation, scientific monitoring of climate adaptation, all the elements needed for responsive management during environmental crises." Hammond nodded thoughtfully, though her attention seemed focused more on Maya's scientific explanation of watershed management than the senator's political framing. As one of the most influential conservation funders in the region, her support could potentially influence broader coalition building around the proposed legislation. The critical factor in successful drought intervention is maintaining family band integrity, Maya explained to the group, indicating how the rehabilitation center's northern sector had been designated as a specialized transitional territory. Separating bonded Mustangs creates cascading stress responses that compromise both physical and behavioral health. Our protocols prioritize keeping bands intact whenever possible, which significantly improves adaptation success rates. The explanation resonated particularly with the ranchers, who nodded with the recognition of experienced horse handlers. "Makes sense," one commented. "Same principles apply with domestic stock. Break up established herds, and you create problems that wouldn't otherwise exist." Jackson noted this point of connection with satisfaction. Building bridges between conservation interests and traditional ranching communities represented one of his long-term strategic objectives, finding common ground rather than perpetuating the adversarial relationships that had historically complicated wild horse management policies. As the tour continued, an unexpected development occurred. Lisa approached quietly, indicating an urgent message on her tablet. Jackson stepped aside briefly to review the information, his expression remaining neutral despite the potentially concerning update. "Movement in the northern sector," Lisa reported softly. "Diamond's band is heading toward the Central Creek crossing, which would bring them within visual range of observation point 3, the next stop on our tour route." The situation presented both opportunity and challenge. A natural sighting would provide powerful connection for the visitors, potentially enhancing support for their conservation mission. However, it also created risk of disturbance to the Mustangs, particularly if visitors failed to maintain appropriate protocols. Jackson considered the options quickly before making his decision. "Adjust the route. We'll proceed to observation. Point 4 instead, bypassing the creek crossing entirely. Notify Maya discreetly." Lisa nodded, understanding the prioritization without requiring explanation. The rehabilitation center's first responsibility remained the welfare of the animals under their protection, regardless of potential fundraising implications. As they continued the tour, Jackson maneuvered to speak privately with Senator Williams, explaining the situation. "We've received reports that the Mustang band is moving toward an area on our planned route. We're adjusting to avoid potential disturbance." The senator's expression registered momentary disappointment, clearly recognizing the lost photo opportunity. Before shifting to understanding. "Proper protocols, of course. That's exactly the professional standard that makes your work here so valuable." The respect in his tone suggested appreciation for maintaining ethical priorities, rather than compromising for political convenience, a promising indication for future collaboration on legislative initiatives. When they reached observation, point 4, which overlooked a different section of the sanctuary focusing on habitat restoration projects, Maya smoothly adjusted her presentation to highlight drought-resistant vegetation initiatives and water conservation systems. Though not directly connected to the Mustang rescue narrative that had captured public attention, these projects represented the substantive infrastructure that made wildlife preservation possible during climate crises. As the formal tour concluded, and the group returned to the main compound for a concluding discussion session. Catherine Hammond moved to walk beside Jackson. "I'm impressed," she stated simply. "Not by the rescue story that's captured public attention, though that's certainly noteworthy. I'm impressed by what you didn't do today." Jackson raised an eyebrow questioningly. "You adjusted the tour route to avoid disturbing the Mustangs, knowingly, sacrificing what would have been a powerful viewing opportunity for potential donors," she clarified. "You prioritized animal welfare over fundraising advantage. That's remarkably rare in conservation operations seeking support." Her observation demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the ethical complexities inherent in wildlife conservation work, the constant balancing of public engagement necessities against animal welfare priorities. "It's our fundamental operating principle," Jackson replied. "We serve the wildlife first, not public perception or donor expectations." Hammond nodded approvingly. "The Western Conservation Trust has been developing a targeted initiative focused specifically on climate displacement of iconic species. Your operation appears to be developing exactly the scientific protocols and ethical frameworks our board has identified as priorities for long-term funding." The statement represented significant potential for the Rehabilitation Center's future operational capacity. Hammond's organization typically provided multi-year strategic funding rather than one-time donations, creating sustainable support for scientific research and habitat preservation. As they rejoined the full group for closing discussions in the conference room, Maya presented the Rehabilitation Center's formal proposal, a comprehensive initiative for establishing permanent protected status for displaced Mustang populations, scientific monitoring of adaptation strategies, and development of translatable protocols that could be implemented by other conservation organizations throughout drought-affected regions. "What we're proposing isn't simply protection for one band of Mustangs that captured public attention," she emphasized. "We're developing systematic approaches to climate displacement that could preserve genetic diversity and natural behaviors across multiple wild horse territories facing similar environmental challenges." The broader framing elevated their work beyond the emotional appeal of a single rescue story, positioning it within landscape-scale conservation frameworks that aligned with both scientific priorities and policy initiatives. Senator Williams nodded with particular enthusiasm as she highlighted elements that connected directly with provisions in his proposed legislation. As the formal presentation concluded, the potential supporters engaged in substantive discussion about implementation details, funding mechanisms, and policy implications. The conversation had transcended mere emotional response to wildlife rescue, evolving into meaningful strategic planning for conservation challenges that extended far beyond a single Mustang family. Jackson observed the discussion with cautious optimism, recognizing that they had successfully navigated the delicate transition from media sensation to substantive conservation partnership. When Hammond and Mercer began discussing specific funding commitments and collaborative possibilities, his assessment was confirmed. The Western Conservation Trust is prepared to consider a 3-year funding initiative specifically supporting your climate displacement protocols, Hammond stated, her decisive tone suggesting the conceptual commitment had already been made. "Our board meets next month to finalize the coming fiscal year's major grants. I'd like to present your proposal as a priority initiative." Mercer nodded in agreement. "My foundation's interest lies particularly in the monitoring and data collection aspects. The adaptive behavior tracking you've implemented with this Mustang band could provide valuable data sets for developing predictive models applicable to multiple species facing similar displacement challenges." The technical focus reflected his background in data-driven enterprises and suggested potential for technological enhancements to their scientific methodologies. Such support could significantly expand their research capabilities beyond current operational limitations. Senator Williams, recognizing the momentum building, added his political leverage. My office can facilitate coordination with federal land management agencies to establish this as a pilot program, informing broader policy frameworks. The timing aligns perfectly with both legislative calendars and public awareness. The convergence of interests, scientific, philanthropic, and political, created unprecedented potential for expanding their work beyond the rehabilitation center's traditional scope. What had begun as an emergency intervention for one Mustang family was evolving into a potential model for climate adaptation strategies with implications throughout Western conservation territories. As the meeting concluded and the visitors prepared to depart, Jackson maintained his characteristic reserved professionalism despite the promising developments. Years of both military and conservation experience had taught him that outcomes remained uncertain until fully secured, regardless of encouraging signals. Maya, however, allowed herself a moment of cautious celebration as they watched the vehicles depart. That exceeded best-case scenarios, she acknowledged quietly. Hammond and Mercer represent exactly the type of substantive, science-focused support we need, and the potential policy framework through Williams' legislation could create systemic change rather than just local impact. Jackson nodded in agreement, though his thoughts had already shifted to implementation challenges. If the funding materializes, we'll need to expand our monitoring capabilities, enhance security protocols for the northern sector, and develop formal research parameters beyond current capacity. His focus on operational requirements, rather than celebrating potential success, reflected the mindset that had carried him through countless military missions and conservation challenges: perpetual planning and adaptation rather than premature satisfaction with partial victories. Jackson, Maya said with gentle exasperation, we potentially just secured multi-year funding that could transform our entire operation. The senator is incorporating our protocols into federal legislation. 2 major foundations are considering substantial support. Could you possibly acknowledge the win before immediately moving to the next challenge? A slight smile softened his weathered features. Old habits, he conceded. In Afghanistan, celebrating mission success before complete extraction was considered bad luck. Same principle applies here. The comparison offered rare insight into how his military experience continued shaping his conservation approach. The disciplined focus on completing each phase before acknowledging achievement. The instinctive planning for contingencies even during apparent success. Fair enough, Maya acknowledged. But when the funding actually arrives and the legislation passes, we're taking at least 5 minutes to celebrate before planning the next phase. Jackson's smile widened slightly. Agreed. 5 minutes. As the rehabilitation center staff returned to normal operations following the high-profile visit, the monitoring team reported that Diamond's band had returned to their preferred grazing area in the eastern sector. Through high-powered optics, they could see Esperanza practicing short sprints beside her mother, her coordination improving daily as she developed the distinctive movement patterns of her Spanish Mustang heritage. The small family continued adapting to their new territory, unaware of how their journey had catalyzed human actions that might ultimately protect countless other wild horses facing similar environmental challenges. Their simple pursuit of survival had intersected with human systems in ways that transcended the immediate circumstances of one difficult birth on a stormy night. For Jackson, watching the distant Mustangs through the spotting scope, the connection represented something more personal than conservation policy or scientific research. Their resilience in the face of displacement and danger resonated with his own journey from combat trauma to meaningful purpose. The band's adaptation to new circumstances reflected the same process that had carried him through his darkest periods after leaving military service. "They're going to make it," Maya observed, joining him at the observation point as evening approached. All the physiological indicators are positive. Esperanza's development is actually accelerating beyond standard growth curves. Diamond has fully recovered her condition, and Shadow's territorial behavior has stabilized. They've successfully adapted to their new environment. Jackson nodded, recognizing that her scientific assessment aligned with his more intuitive understanding of the Mustang's situation. "They found what they needed," he said simply. "Sometimes survival means leaving behind what's familiar to find what's necessary." The philosophy applied equally to the Mustang family and to his own life journey. Both had required courage to abandon, establish patterns when circumstances demanded change, navigating uncertainty toward new possibilities that couldn't be fully envisioned at the outset. As the Montana sunset painted the landscape in golden light, the rehabilitation center staff continued their essential work, monitoring wildlife, maintaining habitats, documenting scientific observations, and planning for future challenges. The Mustang family grazed peacefully in their adopted territory, unaware of the broader implications their journey had inspired. Two species with vastly different perspectives and experiences had briefly intersected in a moment of crisis, each contributing what they could to ensure new life survived against challenging odds. What remained was the ongoing commitment to protect the wilderness spaces where such encounters remained possible, preserving both the practical value of biodiversity and the less tangible worth of witnessing wild spirits adapting and enduring in an increasingly complicated world. 6 months passed since the dramatic birth that had captured public attention and transformed the Wild Mustang Rehabilitation Center's trajectory. Montana's summer heat had given way to the crisp chill of autumn, painting the sanctuary's landscape in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. Throughout these changing seasons, Diamond's band had continued to thrive in their adopted territory, establishing regular patterns that reflected successful adaptation to their new environment. Esperanza had grown from the wobbly newborn foal into a sturdy young Mustang, her chestnut coat gleaming with health and her movements displaying the natural athleticism of her heritage. The white diamond marking on her chest had become more pronounced as her adult coat emerged, making her instantly recognizable even at a distance. She now moved with confidence alongside her mother, occasionally testing boundaries with playful bursts of speed that demonstrated her developing independence. On this particular morning, Jackson stood at his customary observation point, documenting the band's activities through high-powered binoculars. The data collection had become more sophisticated over the months, supported by the new funding that had indeed materialized following Senator Williams's visit. Motion-activated cameras strategically placed throughout the Mustang's territory now captured continuous behavioral data, while periodic drone surveys mapped their movement patterns without human disturbance. Maya approached, carrying the comprehensive report they had prepared for the upcoming board meeting. "Final numbers are in," she announced with quiet satisfaction. "The genetic testing confirms it. Diamond carries maternal lineage markers from the Sutherland strain that was believed nearly lost in the prior mountain herds. Esperanza's DNA shows distinctive Spanish colonial characteristics with minimal modern influence. From a conservation genetics perspective, they're exceptionally valuable." The scientific confirmation reinforced what they had suspected from the beginning. This small band of Mustangs represented important genetic diversity within a population increasingly threatened by habitat loss and climate disruption. There, Successful relocation and adaptation offered valuable insights for developing broader conservation strategies applicable to other wild horse populations facing similar environmental pressures. The BLM Review Committee meets next week to consider our proposal, Jackson noted, lowering his binoculars. If approved, this entire northern sector would receive designated conservation status specifically for climate-displaced Mustang populations. The proposal represented an unprecedented approach to wild horse management, creating federally protected territory specifically designed to accommodate bans forced from traditional ranges by environmental factors. The policy innovation had emerged directly from their experience with Diamond's band, supported by meticulous scientific documentation and the political momentum generated by public interest in the story. Maya nodded, aware of both the opportunity and the continuing challenges. Hammond called yesterday. The Western Conservation Trust is extending funding for the monitoring program through the next 3 years. They're particularly interested in Shadow's territorial adaptation patterns, how he's established and maintains boundaries in unfamiliar territory. The stallion's behavior had proven especially valuable for research purposes. Unlike Mustangs relocated through human management programs, Shadow had navigated the transition through entirely natural processes, selecting territory based on instinctive assessment of resources and security. His successful establishment of a stable range within the rehabilitation center's boundaries provided insights into natural selection criteria that could inform future conservation area designs. What about the educational initiative? Jackson asked, referring to the public engagement program they had developed in response to continuing interest in the Mustang family's story. Launching next month, Maya confirmed. The virtual observation platform goes live for schools and universities, allowing remote monitoring without physical disturbance. We've already got over 200 educational institutions registered for the first semester. The moment captured everything their work represented. Not just saving individual animals, but preserving the complex behaviors and relationships that define true wildness. From desperate crisis to thriving new generations, the journey had transformed not only the Mustang's future, but the very approach to wildlife conservation across changing landscapes. As the sun fully cleared the eastern mountains, illuminating both Mustang bands in golden light, Jackson smiled, a full, unreserved expression rarely seen on his weathered features. "They don't need us anymore," he said, his voice carrying satisfaction rather than regret. That was always the point. In that moment of perfect understanding, wild and human worlds achieved the ideal balance, separate yet connected, each honoring the other's existence while maintaining appropriate boundaries. The veteran and the wild horses had saved each other, creating ripples of healing that extended far beyond Montana's rugged mountains into a world increasingly in need of such stories of hope.